So during this time where there seems to be a concerted effort to attack all of the forward progression that the civil rights movement has given us. And to be honest, the civil rights movement is really the tip of the iceberg, because we must recognize that all of the work, the foundational groundwork, was always happening since emancipation, right? Like, since emancipation, the forward progress towards equality, benefits, and human rights for African Americans immediately started. But more specifically, we see how there's a culmination of all of these things happening during the civil rights movement. And so I find it important for us to be able to take a look at what was happening during the civil rights as to how they were able to make as much headway as they were during a time where it was arguably more racist, arguably more restrictive, arguably more oppressive, as in blatant oppression, right, than what it is today. To be able to understand, one, how we got here, and two, what's necessary for us to get ourselves out of it. So within the Black community, there were foundational and fundamental beliefs, right? Fundamentally, you needed an education. Education was important to the forward progression of African Americans. And I think that one of the main reasons as to why this was is because, as we all know, during slavery, it was illegal for Black people to be literate. And that is the bare minimum, right? It's just literacy. We're not even going to talk about reasoning. We're not going to talk about the ability to string together thoughts. We're not even going to talk about the ability to articulate a plan of action, right? Or articulate an opinion. It was illegal to see words and be able to know what that word says, not even what it means. So by the time you get to emancipation, you find that in I would probably say, the next few decades immediately following that, you find this influx of educational institutions. There were two main institutions that sprouted out immediately after emancipation for Black people, and that was churches and schools. Okay? The interesting part for African Americans is that the separation of church and state really didn't exist for us. And that's because churches became our hospitals. Churches also became our schools. Churches also became our meeting spots, our safe places and spaces where we were able to talk about all things related to the Black community. So even the interpretation of church and what our churches did for the community was very much different than how churches operated in white communities. But I digress. There is a fundamental belief amongst all Black people that education was important. And not just formal education, i.e. being going to a 4-year institution and having a degree, right? Like, that's something that became more formalized later on. But it was about It was about craftsmanship. It was about being tutored, right? Like, it was about you having a mentor that taught you how to do these things because they were great at doing it. So I don't want us to get locked into the semantics of education only meaning, doctor, lawyer, engineer type formal education, because there were still accreditations and things that we were still trying to sort out how to be able to do. But what we did know is that John down the road was the best welder in the county. And if you wanted to make a good living, you would try to go to John down the road to learn how to weld. Because when you started your business, they would ask, hey, how did you learn how to do these things? And you saying, John the welder taught me, solidified your work ethic, solidified your processes and procedures and your product. So education of all kinds was very important and was taken very seriously. Furthermore, when you take a look at how we were getting things done, the communities that we were building, it was not a monolith. People were in separate groups, in separate places, working towards the same goal, sometimes unknowingly, which had this effort that was not centralized in one location. Or with one group, right? Because if you only have a centralized effort that is housed and operates only through one group, if you stop that one group, forward progression inevitably stops. But during the civil rights movement, a lot of people focus on kind of the primary groups that help push this movement forward. And to the disservice of the time, we take a look at the figurehead, that being Martin Luther King, that being Malcolm X, that being Huey P. Newton, right? Black Panthers. And we say these were the leaders. And that was not correct. That was not correct. And it does a disservice to the time because there were hundreds of grassroots organizations that merely utilized the figureheads for gaining attention, not for powering the work. You had all of these smaller groups, right? These smaller groups like SNCC, these smaller groups like, the Southern Baptist Convention. You had all of these groups, hundreds of groups that would come together for certain events, for certain speaking engagements, for certain demonstrations. But they were not all from the same group. They were not all located in the same region. And they did not all operate for the same one goal. Like, the overall goal was the forward progression of African Americans towards equality and fairness, yes. However, these different groups were attacking different needs within Black communities, within specific geographical locations. That's what made it such a big deal. And it wasn't a matter of, like, when you're talking about the March on Selma was put on, yes, by a grassroots organization that was located there in Alabama. They were the planners. They were the initiators. But from that planning, they invited all of these different groups to come and join in on their demonstration. They sent an invitation for Martin Luther King to come because they knew where he was located, the media would follow. And I think that when we're talking about our current situation and how we could help move forward our current situation, I think we accidentally frame it as a one band, one sound type of thing without understanding that the band still has various instruments that still practice separately. You have the brass that practice separately. You have percussions that practice separately. But even within the brass and within percussions, you have subgroups of brass and percussions that practice separately because they still have separate parts. Another part of the civil rights movement that I believe that we overlook is presentation. Because presentation still matters. And it shouldn't. You're right. It shouldn't. But the way that you dress and the way that you speak still matters. And that's why certain figures were used to portray and convey certain messages. And this isn't something that is new. This is something that was also done during slavery because you understood that those that were in the house had certain impact and certain influence that those that were in the field did not. But at the same time, you had those that were in the field that were considered the slave owners' favorites that were also utilized to carry a message because they could elicit favor that other people could not. They could push the envelope a little further than other people. And because of that, you knew that in order for this message, in order for this movement, in order for this thought, this idea to have a chance, not even to work, right? Because sometimes they wouldn't want it to work just because they wouldn't want it to work, right? But in order for it to have a chance to work, you knew I had to get this person's buy-in. I had to get them to be a part of this plan and not to just be on the fringes or the outskirts of the plan. I had to get them to be an intricate part of this plan in order for this to have a chance at working. When we take a look at the current climate and what's going on, right? Can we identify a person or people who have the ability to move a message forward towards the intended goal? That we can say we need their buy-in. We need their buy-in. Because if you take a look at it, right, and this is something that I was mulling over, especially during this whole Target situation, right? As we all know, Target decided they were going to roll back DEI. Very foolish business plan. Very stupid idea. Okay, backfired bigly in the terms of our president, and they have not been the same since. Hard few months. But I found it very interesting that the executives at Target went to go and ask Reverend Al Sharpton for advice. That goes to show you the lack of the changing of the guards. Because if I'm not mistaken, Reverend Al Sharpton is in his 70s. He is quite a few generations removed from being in the trenches. You see what I'm saying? But they literally have no current voice that can influence a population broadly within the African American community that would be able to say, this is what we need. This is what we desire in order for you to correct it. And interestingly enough, if I'm not mistaken, the person that called the boycott was Reverend Jamal Bryant, but they didn't call him. Okay? They didn't call him. And so I find it very interesting when we take a look at some of these factors and we take a look at if we have the modern day equivalent to that in us being able to organize, to be able to say, hey, these are the things that we need, and these are the rights that we are safeguarding. To be able to take traumatic experiences and traumatic events to then push a narrative that says, this is why we have to do what we are doing. Because we need that. Which is essentially what Martin Luther King for sure did, but also Malcolm X. When you take a look at the movement of the Nation of Islam, specifically happening in the northern region of the East Coast, New York. When things happened, my guy was outside on the soapbox, talking through a megaphone, saying, this is why we out here. Because we got news that the police up round the way was doing X, Y, and Z. And this is why we got to mobilize. Do not be mistaken. The movement that happened, that was pushed forward by the Nation of Islam, wasn't just about having brothers and sisters convert to the Nation of Islam. It was like, yeah, sure. Some of them did. But some of them helped support and push forward the message because it was beneficial to the community. And they did so without joining the Nation of Islam. Even though the civil rights movement as a whole does have religious representation, not just Christian representation. You also had a very, very large support doing their part to advance in the Nation of Islam. And then you had off on the West Coast a more tip of the spear approach. And yeah, none of them agreed with each other at certain points. May I remind you that they ran Martin Luther King out of New York. And if I'm not mistaken, out of Chicago. They was like, listen, these people is up here beating us, and you down south talking about some hold tight, wipe the blood from your eye. We not for that. We not for that. Okay? You had the Black Panthers that had headquarters not only in Los Angeles, but they were also like, hey, we see you, Midwest. We're going to go ahead and put our foot in Chicago as well, because we see what's happening with our brothers and sisters in Chicago. And so you had all of these movements that are happening. That's adding to adding to the movement, adding gas, adding fuel. And you see the movement move forward, which is not a movement that is singular. It's not just a singular movement. Now, what we have to understand is during this time, lynchings are at an all-time high. People are getting drug up and down in the streets. And on top of that, you had presidents that did not want to engage with what was going on. And you had big homie J. Edgar Hoover that was running the FBI ragged, trying to stop this movement. Having people try to infiltrate the movement. Not just white people, Black people. The FBI was not recruiting Black people to begin with. But by the time that the civil rights movement became a target and a focus for the FBI, you had J. Edgar Hoover that was like, hold on. Hold up. We gonna have to get some people that blend in a little bit better to be able to get us the information that we need for us to be able to know what their plans are, so that we could put a stop to this. And it's very interesting, the approach that they took, which is J. Edgar Hoover weaponized the ability for the community to be self-sustaining outside of white people in the government. That was the bad part. That was the bad part. It was the weaponization of being self-sustaining. The weaponization of having those things that immediately post-emancipation, white people, racist, white nationalists, however you want to be able to identify them, said you must have, because you can't have none of the stuff that we got. Right? And in order for us to be able to obtain those things, we had to become credentialed in the things that are necessary in order to sustain a community, which is medical assistance, which is banking, which is construction, which is landscaping, which is housing, which is grocery stores, which is restaurants, which is schools, which is, lawmakers, which is governance, which is policing and safety. These are all the things that you have to know how to do in order to create them within the community, in order to sustain the community. And that was weaponized. That was weaponized. While at the same time, we understood that the creating of these communities, the educating ourselves, do not be confused. These figureheads, or the people that we have deemed to be the face of the civil rights movement, were educated. Were educated. Martin Luther King was a doctor. That is the highest level of education obtained in a certain subject matter. He was a doctor. Huey Newton, he was a PhD. That's a doctor. Right? Malcolm X, even though he may not have had a doctor in front of his name, he was educated. He read books. He took classes. He was learned. And when you take a look at those people that were not considered the figureheads or the face of the movement, they were still so educated that people invited them to lecture and debate the topic at the most prestigious schools in the world, the Cambridges, the Oxfords, the Harvards. There is footage of them going to debate the very conditions of Black people in America. And those debates were so respected that the lecture halls would be packed out, wall to wall, nothing but scholars. Black scholars, white scholars, Asian scholars, etc. It was broadcasted on the radio and on television. I ask you today, who has a movement or is a part of a movement that can articulate the plight and the condition, the current condition of those that are being ostracized, of those that are being marginalized, and it be so respected that people decide to pack out a lecture hall and give hours to the conversation. This also extends to our literary greats. When you think about the Toni Morrisons, Alice Walker, and those voices that lended themselves, like Langston Hughes, that sought to analyze the human condition the inhumanity within the human condition and how it impacts our interpretation and socialization amongst one another within their time. Who is doing that today on a broad scale, right? Because do we have our 3 to 4, maybe 5 authors that are currently carrying that torch right now? Absolutely. In comparison to the burst of literature that was being produced and that was being disseminated and consumed, how does it compare? While we currently have more technology, less red tape, right? Like we have less red tape in that we don't have to go through specific publishing houses for them to approve the message, for them to then disseminate it. You can do that through Amazon on your own. You could utilize, podcast. You could utilize, social media to be able to gain your own traction, to be able to create your own books, your own pamphlets, your own handouts. And word of mouth is happening quicker in today's society. And I think that when I take a look at how we are able to get the ground back that we lost, because that ground was important ground, right? I think that we have to get to a place where we agree that there are certain fundamental things that are necessities to be able to help maintain and stabilize this movement, to be able to progress it forward. And when I take a look at organizations, how we're working together, how are we collaborating? To me, we could do more. And that's me included. Because, where we're at, the Democrats fumbled. The Democrats fumbled bad. And they have their role that they played in this. But so do we. So do we. Because I believe, due to me being a part of a generation that was born into not the struggle of trying to get some of these everyday fundamental rights, but the privilege of already having them instated and legally enforced, right? Like, there's one thing for us to be able to believe it because it says it in the preamble of the Constitution, right? That the Constitution and the Bill of Rights gives us this narrative that says all men are created equal and they should have access to unalienable rights and their posterity should be able to pursue the American dream, right? That's one thing. There is something else where you are a part of a minority population that at one point in time in history, those words did not apply to you. And during that time in history, you had people that taught their posterity that those words did not apply to you, therefore needing new words that were specifically double binding you into the Constitution so that you can then be a recipient of these things, right? I think that when you are born into those rights, without understanding and somehow holding in front of you sacred the blood, sweat, tears, and fight that got you there, you can become apathetic and reinforcing the need to hold the line. And I think that on that front, we have done our ancestors a disservice. And we not only see this when it comes down to the civil rights movement, we also see it when it comes down to Roe v. Wade, right? The ability to choose, the strides forward medically for women and for Black people and for people of color and other minorities. The ability to be treated and treated well. Not only that, the appreciation amongst Black people for Black establishment. Done well. And so when I take a look at what's currently happening to us, I am also very careful to take a look at and analyze the groundwork that we did not do to maintain. And the thing about grassroots organization is that we know it works. How do we know it works? Well, it got us all of these rights during a more racist time, when it was a lot harder to do a lot less. But even then, in more recent times, we see how grassroots quite literally funded the Obama campaign and got him 2 terms in office, where the average donation was less than $100. And even then, more recent, where we saw the grassroots organization that propelled Kamala Harris in a little over 100 days as she attempted to do the impossible, while acknowledging that they gave the most impossible task to a Black woman to see if she could overcome a most impossible task. It didn't require everyone to believe in everything that was being said or agree in everything that she was saying. So this totalitarian mindset of needing to wholly agree with the person in order for you to vote for them or in order for you to support them is an inherent roadblock to forward progression. Why? Because everybody knew that Martin Luther King had flaws and what those flaws were. However, that did not stop them from recognizing that his work in progressing equality for Black people needed their support, and they therefore supported him, while also saying 2 things can be true at the same time. Humans are complex, and we cannot by any means try to simplify the complexity of humanity. And when they do not fit into the simplification, which inevitably no one does, we then abandon and choose the greater evil as a way to punish them for not being simple, while also at the same time allowing it to be okay that we agree with someone else who does not fit those same standards. We have to be aware and we have to be mindful. So let this episode cause you to think things through and consider what organizations around you can you get active in. And I know that sacrificing time looks much different today than what it did back then, because we have to work longer hours. We have to spend more time away from our families because the cost of living has went up higher and the rate of pay has not increased in a commensurate manner to the cost of living. And you're tired and it's a sacrifice. But the same way that we sacrificed for the rights that we were able to secure within the civil rights movement is the same way that we must be willing to sacrifice something for the rights that we need to obtain today. Because the reality is that the other side is sacrificing. And they consider it worth the sacrifice. They consider it worth the time spent. They consider it worth the meetings they go to, the people they surround themselves with. And they actively bring people along with them. I believe that we should do the same. I believe that we should be willing to start wildfires, many of them, that all will work together to set ablaze and mobilize what it is that we need today. Because it is overwhelming due to the fact that they have reversed and weaponized the same plan that helped us get what we need. They have multiple groups that believe multiple things. We found this out just because of the whole Charlie Kirk situation. We didn't know about Groypers. We didn't know that there were people that were MAGA versus non-MAGA, that believed and supported this thing but didn't believe and support that thing. Because similarly to the civil rights movement, when they all come together, they all look like one band, one sound. We've got to be willing to do the same. Because I believe that when we're willing to do that same thing, we won't be as overwhelmed. We'll be able to fight on more fronts. We'll be able to rejuvenate ourselves, to have longevity in the fight. And inevitably, we will begin to cover ground and make a positive impact forward. And I believe that wholeheartedly. So I encourage you to join community. I encourage you to be willing to join in where you can at the local level. And when there is a national opportunity, join in wherever you can. Black people, I am not telling you to walk the streets. All right? Join in where you can and how you can. Because we understand that they are attempting to have violence in the streets by seeing Black people walk the streets as to why we have not been doing so. But there are other ways for you to be able to still put in the work. And it doesn't matter the size. It doesn't matter how small or how large your individual group is. because united, we are still better together.